So, welcome to the fourth and final part of the life and legacy of William Carey, which is part of a larger series we're doing on a history of Christian missions. The influence of William Carey and his colleagues went far beyond Bible translation. They believed in the power of the gospel not only to transform individuals, but also to transform cultures and communities. And they used their influential position and their voices to protest vigorously against all manner of destructive, evil, cultural practices that they found in India. And with the help and support of others, because they didn't work alone, this sometimes resulted in the outlawing and the abolition of some deeply embedded Hindu practices. So let me begin by sharing a few examples. One day in 1794, William Carey and his fellow missionary, Dr. John Thomas, were riding near Malda in India when they saw, quote, a basket hung in a tree in which an infant had been exposed. The skull remained, the rest having been devoured by ants. This so-called holy act of infanticide had been committed with religious fervor by a Hindu mother. Now, while infanticide was not uncommon in India in those days, the British government ignored the sacrifice of infants as it didn't want to interfere in the religious matters of the people. I mean, similarly today, some sociologists, anthropologists, and others are critical of the work of missionaries, accusing them of destroying simple, primitive cultures. But the Indian masses were ready to sacrifice their lives and the lives of their infants for the sake of salvation and to escape the endless karma samsara cycle. What that means is basically the belief that actions in a previous existence determine your fate in your next existence. And that's reached through an endless process of births and rebirths. The people were intensely religious and were following, though sometimes misinterpreting, written religious laws. In 1802, William Carey's colleague, the printer William Ward, studied infanticide on a little island in a river called Sogar. He found that many women made vows to the holy Ganges River, quote, that if blessed with 2 children, one will be presented to the river. He estimated that as many as 100 children, although possibly many more, were being sacrificed every year. William Carey strongly protested these crimes against humanity. And he was one of many who prodded the apparently passive government to halt or regulate a variety of harmful social practices. William Carey Jr. told his father about one sacrifice. He explained how a boatman had pulled a drowning child into his boat and presented the infant back to its mother. She took the child, broke its neck, and threw it back into the river. After joining Fort William College as a professor, William Carey protested to the British governor. At the time, it was General Lord Wellesley regarding infanticide. Wellesley then called for a study of the frequency, the nature, and the causes of infanticide in Bengal. While William Carey prepared an exhaustive report, other people were protesting as well. And after the attention of the government had been drawn to it, and Lord Wellesley was convinced about it, infanticide was abolished in India in 1802, even before William Carey had presented his report. And just as abortion and euthanasia are major concerns among Christians today, similar issues 200 years ago regarding the start of life, infanticide, and the end of life, euthanasia, were stirring Christians to act. The sick and dying were treated in a way that was causing another great matter of concern. They were often taken to the banks of the holy rivers and allowed to die. William Ward describes such murders, quote, "When a person is on the point of death, his relations carry him on his bed or on a stretcher to the river Ganges. A person in his last agonies is dragged from his bed and carried in the coldest or the hottest weather from whatever distance to the riverside, where he lies, if a poor man, in the open air, day and night, until he finally expires. In some cases, the practice veiled simple death." Well, in the influential journal published in Serampore called Friend of India, in 1802, William Carey protested against the act, but declared that, quote, "controlling the practice would require delicate handling, for the strongest religious feelings of the Hindus were involved." Yet it was strongly felt to be the right time to seek to halt the savage cruelty, even when perpetrated by those who were well-meaning. And until it was officially abolished, the missionaries would occasionally carry home people who were exposed to die and would nurse them back to health, while continually writing and publishing against this social evil. Finally, an otherwise passive and insensitive British government was forced to halt such exposures of the sick and the dying. Similarly, lepers were rejected by society, and their families, who sometimes either helped them in committing suicide or engaged in outright murder, were also clearly involved in a very bad way. Carey witnessed this in 1812. This is what he wrote. "A pit about 10 cubits deep, that would be 15 feet or 4.5 meters, it was dug, and a fire was placed at the bottom of it, onto which the leper was placed. The poor man rolled himself and struggled for the purpose of getting out of the pit. But his mother and sister thrust him back in again. Thus, a young man who to all appearances might have survived for several years was cruelly burned to death." Carey continues, quote, "I find that the practice is not uncommon in these parts. The belief is that a violent end purifies the body and ensures its transmigration into a healthy new existence, while a natural death by disease will result in 5 successive rebirths. The leper, like the even more wretched widow, has always courted suicide. And others who suffered from what Carey called the great sickness were drowned." Now, the missionaries, who well understood the power of the written word, again used this vital tool, And once again, it was the influential journal published in Serampore called The Friend of India. It was used to make the pathetic situation of lepers known and to call for better provision. Carey and Dr. Thomas provided medicine as well as preaching for many lepers. One missionary wife wrote in 1803, quote, "This morning, 34 poor people met before our door, many with the leprosy, some with the ends of their fingers, some with their toes eaten off by the disease. Many of them receive just 2 pence a week. Brother Carey gives them medicine for their bodies and the best medicine for their poor souls." And I remember some years ago in India being asked if I was prepared to speak to a group of lepers. I said I'd be very happy to. And they took me to a place close to a railway line in a sort of slightly deserted area outside of habitations. And there they were all gathered, mainly women, excited and eager, and especially a unique opportunity for a white man to come and talk to them. They looked a pathetic bunch in some ways, their fingers, their hands, sometimes their noses were missing. But what an opportunity for me to stand there and share the gospel of Jesus Christ. They clearly received it with joy in their hearts. And I went away from there with an overwhelming sense of privilege at having that opportunity. In 1808, William Carey wrote a letter to John Ryland. John Ryland was a friend of John Newton, and he was one of the founders of the Baptist Missionary Society. And Carey explained his contribution to these matters. Quote, "I have, since I've been here, presented 3 petitions to the government for the purpose of having the burning of women and other modes of murder abolished. And in the case of infanticide and voluntary drowning in the river, laws were made to prevent these, which have been successful." And this marked the first time the British government interfered directly with religious practices in India. And it set the stage for the abolition of many other practices. Last week, I explained how William Ward, the printer in the Serampore trio, because of failing health, was forced to return to England in 1819, where he tried for 4 years to negotiate a growing struggle that threatened to engulf the work in India. So what was this growing struggle between the Serampore team and the Baptist Mission Society? Well, while the first 15 years at Serampore were years of cooperation and teamwork, it has to be said that the 15 years that followed were filled with turmoil. It was because with the passing of time, new missionaries arrived in India who were unwilling to live in the communal fashion of the Serampore Fellowship. For instance, one missionary demanded, quote, "a separate house, a stable and servants." So, unsurprisingly, the new group clashed with the senior long-term members and vice versa. As Ruth Tucker notes in her biography, they found Joshua Marshman, in particular, to be dictatorial, assigning them duties and locations which were not to their liking. Do you remember Joshua Marshman was one of the 3? William Ward, the printer, Joshua Marshman was the evangelist and teacher, and William Carey was the translator. Now, there were doubtless faults on both sides, with the new missionaries feeling marginalized, frustrated, and ignored, while the senior workers were so settled in their ways, they were not really open to change. I think many of us have been in situations where we've been familiar with this scenario. One does wonder that if the new missionaries had shown the same love and long suffering that had been characteristic of the Serampore team, the differences could perhaps have been ironed out. Unfortunately, the bitter accusations continued to fly around against the senior missionaries, with the result that eventually there was a split between the two groups. The new junior members walked away and formed the Calcutta Missionary Union and began working only a few kilometres away from their Baptist brethren. William Ward described the situation as indelicate. Before long, the Home Committee received the news of the split and they became involved, which in reality only made the situation even worse. That was partly because the initial committee that had been headed by Andrew Fuller no longer existed. That small committee of just 3 members had increased in size several times. And most of the present members only knew of William Carey by name or through his letters. Andrew Fuller and one of the original members had died, leaving the Home Committee now clearly stacked in favour of the new junior members, whom they knew and whom they had personally commissioned as missionaries. While Fuller had been in charge, he had insisted that Serampore should be self-governing. And that was for 2 important reasons. Firstly, the committee felt it was better that the Serampore Fellowship govern themselves rather than be governed by the committee. And secondly, the distance was just too huge for those in England to give any sensible, timely direction for the work in India. And anyway, they would never fully understand all the complications and the unique situations that were taking place on the field. But now, the new Home Committee strongly disagreed. They believed that all the important affairs of the Serampore mission should be under their direct control. Finally, 1826, after many years of long, drawn-out, unhappy conflict, the Serampore mission broke its relationship with the Baptist Missionary Society. This split proved to be a financial blow to the Serampore missionaries, because although they had been financially self-sufficient for most of their history, times were changing. There were now new missionaries at more than a dozen different stations who both needed support and medical care, and it was no longer possible for the Serampore team to support them all. With William Ward now dead, Carey and Marshman eventually swallowed their pride and submitted to the new committee. And shortly afterwards, money and encouraging kind letters started to flow once again. Carey had been a missionary in India for 40 years without ever having one furlough, so he never returned to England. He kept his faculties to the very end and died on June the 9th, 1834, 2 months before his 73rd birthday. To be honest, that he should have lived so long at that time was itself astonishing, given the health challenges he had experienced and the lifestyle he had lived. He was buried alongside his second wife, Charlotte, and the Danish flag was flown at half-mast, acknowledging with respect that he was held in and the sincere gratitude that his unstinting service had generated. The ministry of Carey and others had a profound impact on everything from agriculture, medicine, education, infanticide, and sati. And let me finish with an example of sati, S-A-T-I, or you could spell it S-U-T-T-E, sati. Something that Carey witnessed, which is probably the thing which he is best known for successfully fighting against. Burning a woman to death. In Carey's day, some Hindus believed that when a man died, his widow should be burned alongside him. In that way, that was in fact the only way the widow could obtain eternal happiness. And it was in 1799 that Carey first encountered this practice. He wrote, "As I was returning from Calcutta, I saw a number of people assembled on the riverside. I asked them what they were doing there, and they told me that it was to burn the body of a dead man. I inquired if his wife would die with him. They answered yes, and pointed to the woman. She was standing by a pile of wood, on the top of which lay the dead body of her husband. Her nearest relation stood by, and near her was a small basket of sweetmeats. I asked them if this was the woman's choice, or if she were brought to it by any improper influence. They answered that it was perfectly voluntary. I talked until reasoning was of no use, and then began to exclaim with all my might against what they were doing, telling them that it was a shocking murder. They told me it was a great act of holiness, and added in a very surly manner that if I did not like to see it, I might go further off, and they desired me to go. I told them I would not go, that I was determined to stay and see the murder, and that I should certainly bear witness of it at the tribunal before God. I exhorted the woman not to throw away her life, to fear nothing, for no evil would follow her refusal to burn. But she, in a most calm manner, mounted the pile, danced upon it with her hands extended as if in the utmost tranquility of spirit. Previous to her mounting the pile, the relation whose office it was to set fire to the pile led her 6 times around it. And as she went around, she scattered the sweetmeats above mentioned among the people, who picked it up and ate it as a very holy thing. This being ended, she lay down by the corpse and put one arm under its neck and another over it, when a quantity of dry cocoa leaves and other substances were heaped over them to a considerable height, and then ghee, or melted preserved butter, was poured on the top. Two bamboos were then put over them and held fast down, and the fire was put to the pile, which immediately blazed very fiercely, owing to the dry and combustible materials of which it was composed. No sooner was the fire kindled than all the people started a great shout, Haribol, Haribol, which is a common shout of joy and an invocation of Hari, the wife of Her, or Sib. It was impossible to have heard the woman had she groaned or even cried aloud on account of the mad noise of the people. And it was impossible for her to stir or struggle on account of the bamboos, which were held down on her like the levers of a press. We made much objection to their using these bamboos and insisted that it was using force to prevent the woman from getting up when the fire burned her. But they declared that it was only done to keep the pile from falling down. We could bear to see no more, but left them exclaiming loudly against the murder and full of horror at what we had seen. Eventually, Carey, as much as anyone, was responsible for the final outlawing of the practice of sati. Among Carey's last words were these: "I have no fears, I have no doubts, I have no wish left unsatisfied." Long before his death, Carey had to some become a famous, even a mythical figure. Back in England, some of his acquaintances began collecting relics from his youth and from his early life. A cup from which he had drunk, a pair of shoes he had made, a wooden board advertising his cobbler business. But Carey would have none of it. He said, "The less said about me, the better." When he lay dying in 1834, he summoned fellow missionary Alexander Duff to his side and whispered, "Mr. Duff, you've been speaking about Dr. Carey, Dr. Carey. When I'm gone, say nothing about Dr. Carey, but speak about Dr. Carey's saviour." Over a short period of time, in the 1990s, I visited the graves of two significant people in world history. Firstly, while I was ministering in Russia, I located Lenin's mausoleum, or Lenins Tomb. It's there today in Red Square in Moscow, where his preserved body is on public display. In fact, it's been there continuously since 1 week after his death, almost 100 years ago in 1924. Lenin was influenced by the teachings of Karl Marx. He and his associates founded what today is known as the Soviet Union, centralizing power in the new Communist Party. In the process, tens of thousands were killed or interned in concentration camps. An even greater number were killed by his successor, who led the Soviet government, one Joseph Stalin. So I went to the mausoleum. I joined the queue outside. We were told that we were not allowed to talk once we were inside. And there was this, looked like a wax model. It's been a body that's been embalmed for almost 100 years. There's a whole team of scientists still today making sure it's preserved. But I got told off because as we were walking around, I had my hands in my pockets and one of the armed Soviet soldiers beckoned me in a very direct manner to take my hands out of my pockets. In 1996, 25 years ago, I was on board the MV Doulos, one of OM's former ships, as we sailed up the Hooghly River into Calcutta. That was a brave step of faith by the captain because the Hooghly River rises and falls, and we had a 2-hour window where there was a sufficient depth for the ship to sail in. While in Calcutta, I met Mother Teresa. That's another story for another day. But I also determined I would go and visit the grave of William Carey. I had to locate where Serampore was because that's outside Calcutta. And I remember as I went there, I wondered what I would find. As I approached it, I found that it was in a field which had, until the day before I arrived, very long grass. In fact, if it had had very long grass, I would have been strongly advised not to go in because of snakes, but they had cut the grass the day before. Now, it was surrounded by a sort of a rather crumbling wire fence, and the gate was locked. Next to the gate was a simple house, and in there was the man who held the key to opening the gate to going into this graveyard. He seemed quite reluctant to help me, but eventually he agreed to do so, and afterwards I gave him some rupees for his service. And I walked in and I walked up to the grave of William Carey, and I have to say I was shocked by what I found. It was dirty, it was covered in leaves, it was neglected, and I knelt down. I just couldn't believe that somebody who'd had such a powerful influence as him, even discounting the Christian side of things, what he had introduced to India was so disregarded. I think I'm right in saying it's a little bit different today. I certainly hope it is. So I brushed the leaves off his grave, and there it was, the tomb of William Carey. Let me show you. I have here somewhere a picture. Here we are. I'll just hold it in position so you can see. So I walked along that concrete path up to the end, and you can see in the middle of the picture a sort of an orange slab on the ground. That's the grave. Make sure I'm going the right way here. Yeah. Right, there it is. And if I move this, I think we should be able to see. Yeah, there we are. There it is. It was actually more like this when I saw it, covered in leaves. But this is after it's been cleaned. And there it is. William Carey, date of his birth, date that he died. And then look at the epitaph, which he chose. A wretched, poor, and helpless worm, on thy kind arms I fall. And I stood there and I thanked God. And then left. How can it be that someone who had such an impact is left physically with such a poor memorial, and somebody who caused so many deaths in the world can have such a fancy tomb? You and I know who truly made a positive difference on this planet. A few quotes from William Carey. First of all, from his sister and from his brother. His sister, Mary Carey, said this: whatever he began, he finished. Difficulties never discouraged him. Tom, the brother of William Carey, said this: he was determined never to give up a particle of anything on which his mind was set. And what did he say? Well, I've already told you the best known quote of his, which he uttered at that mission meeting all those years ago. Expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. He also said the work to which God sets his hand will infallibly prosper. And he also said this: the God who can do for and do through a poor shoemaker, such as he has done for and through me, can bless and use anyone. The very humblest may trust him. But I think my favourite quote is one we don't often hear from William Carey, but one I've often thought about. He said this: I am not afraid of failure. I am afraid of succeeding in things that don't matter. Wow. What a legacy. What a life. William Carey, 1761 to 1792, an uneducated cobbler. 1793 to 1834, a missionary, a professor of languages in India, and the father of the modern missions movement today. So there we are. Join us next week, because next week we're going to meet a dynamic Scottish single lady who came from a very dysfunctional background and rose to become the first woman vice-consul of the British Empire. You can unmute yourselves. God bless you, everybody. Love to see you, Colin.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank
Gareth,
you.
enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. And Diane round the corner. God bless you.
Yes, she's down around the corner.
so much.
Right.
Well,
See
the
you,
clocks
Colin.
change next Sunday. Are people aware?
What?
The clocks change next
Oh,
Sunday.
good point there.
No.
In England, they do. I don't know about other places. Yes.
When are you
yeah,
going
what's
to
that?
be?